Hello, welcome. I'm Madeline Craig. I'm an educator and a life coach for families struggling with a loved one's drug or alcohol abuse. And this is another episode of my video blog, which I call Hope for Families TV, because I intend for all of my work to offer you hope in what I know is a very dark situation. So in this episode, I'm going to do a deeper dive into boundaries. Now, I've said this before, but I need to repeat it here. Setting boundaries is both one of the most difficult things to do and also one of the most effective forms of communication when it comes to a loved one abusing substances. In fact, boundaries may be the key to keeping your next holiday from turning into another shit show. What many people don't realize, however, is that if boundaries are also set with compassion and without shame, they are also one of the best ways to positively influence your loved one's use. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about what boundaries are, the importance of boundaries, how to communicate them with love, and why they are essential for both your loved one, whether they're in recovery or not, and the well-being of the entire family. So let's get started with what boundaries are and what they're not. One of the most important things to understand about boundaries is actually what they are not. And that is that they are not about control and they are not about punishment. And that's actually a good thing, because trying to control another person often backfires and makes the situation worse. And you don't have control anyway. But as I always say, you do have influence. And boundaries, when they're set right, are one of the most effective ways to positively influence your loved one's use. So if boundaries aren't about control, then what are they about? Boundaries are actually about you. In dictionary terms, boundaries are the invisible lines that define the limits of acceptable behavior within a relationship. They are not barriers meant to isolate or punish, but rather safeguards to promote mutual respect and well-being in a relationship. Boundaries actually respect another person's autonomy, the fact that they're free to behave as they choose. And they're also free to face the consequences of that behavior. So boundaries state that if a person engages in certain behaviors, then walls, aka a boundary, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the behavior, will start to go up in the relationship. So boundaries are manners and degrees in which you will no longer connect with and or support the other person. What these walls, these boundaries look like can be highly variable and are often specific to the context. One of those important contexts is actually what kind of relationship you have with the person. So for example, boundaries with minor children will sometimes look very different than boundaries with adults. So because I know setting boundaries can be so scary and can be hard to think about what to do with them, I want to give you some examples of what boundaries with your loved one abusing substances could look like. So to start, here are some examples of what boundaries could look like with adults. So 1, I will not get in a car with you if you are drinking, or even I will call the police if I know you are drinking and driving while intoxicated in order to protect everyone on the road. Might be helpful to emphasize everyone on the road, just so your loved one knows this is not a punishment. I'm just taking care of people. And I would state that as you set that boundary. 2, you will not be welcome or you will be asked to leave family gatherings if you are under the influence of substances. Or I will leave an event or a family gathering on my own if you are under the influence of substances. 3, I will not let you live here if you continue to use. 4, I will not wake you up so you can be somewhere you need to be or call in to work for you if you're too hungover. 5, I will not cover your expenses because you spent your money on substances or in other irresponsible ways driven by the substance use. And of course, the boundary family members sometimes need to set as a last resort, which is, I will not continue a relationship with you at all if you continue to use. So those are just some examples for adults, and you can improvise with those. And while those boundaries I just mentioned can also be set with children, here are some others that you might use with minor children as well. So 1, if you continue to use, you will no longer have access to the family car and we will not pay your insurance. 2, if you continue to use, we will no longer pay for your phone. 3, if you continue to use, we will block your access to the internet. 4, if you continue to use, we will limit other activities. And I'm sure you can think of other things, any non-essential benefits you are funding for a minor child that can be withdrawn as a boundary. So hopefully you're getting the idea here, and you can adapt these to your own situation, as I said, and your own situation may have other examples that you can use, but I wanted to give you those examples of what boundaries could look like so you have some kind of starting point. But no matter what boundaries you decide to set, it's important to consider what you will use as acceptable evidence of use. Some families go so far as to require a drug or a breathalyzer test. Others focus more on the unacceptable behavior that accompanies the use. Now, if you're focusing more on the unacceptable behavior that accompanies the use, then you will need to outline that behavior in the boundary. In fact, you may want to outline a list of unacceptable behaviors that accompany the use as evidence. So if you're using and become belligerent or start slurring your speech, then that will trigger the boundary. No matter which route you take, it's important the boundary be clear and wherever possible communicated ahead of time. It's not that you can't set a boundary in the middle of a situation. You absolutely can, and you absolutely should if that's what's needed. But communicating them ahead of time, if you can, is ideal. But who knows, maybe you set the first time you set a boundary, it's set in the moment, and then you clearly communicate that this will be the boundary moving forward. So that's what boundaries are, and some examples of boundaries you may choose to set with your loved one. Some of these, like your loved one's participation at events, can be directly linked to the holidays, but all of them can be useful year-round. Now, before I move on to the connection between boundaries and recovery and how to communicate boundaries with compassion and empathy, which is essential when you're setting them, I first want to talk about the partner to the boundaries, and that's rewards, or what many in the cognitive behavioral therapy field call positive reinforcement. One of the things that so often happens in families affected by addiction and other dysfunction is that boundaries get weaponized and used as tools of coercion and shame. Now, if that's how boundaries are used, their chance of having a positive influence on the use is absolutely nil. In fact, they'll have the opposite effect. So if you really want to make the most of boundaries, it's essential that you both set them with compassion and also pair them with rewards and positive reinforcement. The reward is not about something material, although it can be that too, but it's mostly about support, appreciation, and praise. Setting boundaries without offering support and appreciation for positive behavior is frankly unfeeling, and depending on the extreme, it can even become abuse. At the very least, it renders the relationship very one-sided, all take and no give. So even as you're setting boundaries, it's important to notice what your loved one does well and offer support and praise for that. Additionally, if your loved one has other healthy interests that don't involve substances, you can offer additional support for those interests as well. And of course, you should offer to support in whatever way you reasonably can any efforts they make toward positive change. When it comes to boundaries and rewards, basically what you're saying is that while I can't be a doormat to your use, if you want help with the substance use, I'll support you however I can. And I'll support you and affirm you in any ways I can beyond that. Unfortunately, even rewards can be hard for families to offer their loved ones because so often you're angry, and rightly so. And that anger makes it difficult for family members to see what their loved one is doing right or doing well. I've said a number of times before that setting boundaries is really hard, and it is. But families need support with rewards too. What that actually means is families need a healthy place to vent their anger, and they need an outside perspective that will help them recognize ways they can reward, support, and praise their loved one. Okay, so we've talked about what boundaries are and what they could look like. Now let's talk about the importance of boundaries. Boundaries and rewards positively influence your loved one's use in two ways. The boundaries serve to make the use less attractive. And on the flip side, the rewards serve to make positive change more attractive. But boundaries also serve at least two additional purposes. First and foremost, they provide a framework for a person in recovery to rebuild trust with their loved ones. And that's one of the things recovering people most want to do in their relationships. But building trust takes time, and that can be a challenging thing for a recovering person. However, by clearly defining expectations and consequences, you basically offer your loved one a roadmap for rebuilding that trust, because those boundaries help create a stable and predictable environment, which is not only essential for building trust, it's also essential for the recovery process. Furthermore, boundaries protect both your loved one using substances and the family members from the potential negative consequences of substance abuse. They establish a line between supportive involvement and enabling behaviors on your part, thus helping you, the family member, avoid inadvertently contributing to the cycle of addiction. But as I've said, how you set those boundaries matters, and it's important to communicate those boundaries with empathy and without judgment. And you may need outside effective support to help you do this, because communicating boundaries requires a delicate balance of firmness, enough to show that you're serious, and empathy for the fact that your loved one is struggling with a disease. It's essential to express your concerns and expectations while also maintaining a compassionate and non-judgmental tone. So, because that's hard, I know it's hard, here are some tips for communicating boundaries with love and compassion. So 1, choose the right time and place. To the best of your ability, find a calm and private setting for the conversation. And again, to the best of your ability, make sure your loved one is sober. Now, I know the holiday season can be really chaotic, so to the extent that you can, choose a moment when everyone is relatively relaxed, sober, and focused. 2, use I statements. I know this is not you, but you should frame your concerns in a way that emphasizes your feelings and your experiences. For example, you can say, I feel extra stressed when I see you drinking at family gatherings, instead of making accusatory statements. 3, express empathy. This can be hard, but acknowledging the challenges your loved one is facing and expressing your support for their recovery journey or any kind of positive change is helpful. So let them know that the boundaries are meant to create a healthy and positive environment for everyone involved. It's not just about them and their use. 4, be specific and clear. It's really important to clearly articulate the boundaries you're setting, because ambiguity can lead to misunderstandings and arguments about whether or not the boundary was actually violated. So be specific about the behaviors that are unacceptable and the consequences that may follow. 5, listen actively. This also may be a hard one, but it's important to encourage your loved one to share their perspective and feelings, and then to listen. You don't have to agree with everything your loved one says, but actively listening to what they say actually fosters a sense of mutual understanding and helps strengthen the lines of communication between you. And you may just learn something here that helps you have more compassion and better support your loved one in making positive change. Okay, so those are 5 tips for communicating boundaries with love. But we got one more thing we got to talk about, because establishing boundaries is just the first step. Next is maintaining consistency in those boundaries, because that is equally critical. Consistency provides stability and predictability, which are essential elements for both the individual in recovery and the family. If boundaries aren't consistently enforced, it can lead to confusion and erode the trust that the family is working so hard to rebuild. In fact, one of the first rules of setting boundaries is to not make false threats. If you are not prepared to uphold the boundary, seriously, it is far better not to set it. Because setting a boundary you are not prepared to uphold actually erodes communication and trust. You will not be believed in the future if you do this, and this will erode your loved one's ability to trust you, just as their substance use erodes your ability to trust them. You need to mean it when you set a boundary, and you need to enforce it consistently. And again, you will probably need additional effective support to do this, because it's hard. It really is. However, consistency also reinforces the message that the boundaries are not arbitrary rules, but essential components of maintaining a supportive and healthy environment for the family. It demonstrates a commitment to the well-being of everyone involved, and it emphasizes the importance of personal responsibility in their recovery journey. In fact, not enforcing boundaries consistently only contributes to the dysfunctional relationship dynamics in family addiction because rules and expectations change from one day to the next. And remember, while setting boundaries is a necessary part of supporting yourself, your family, and your loved one, rewards, acknowledgement, encouragement, and praise, in other words, positive reinforcement, are equally important. So celebrate and acknowledge small victories in your loved one's recovery journey. This positive reinforcement helps build self-esteem and reinforces the idea that adhering to boundaries leads to positive outcomes. Boundaries around the holidays are important, but by also focusing on the positive aspects of progress, you can create a more uplifting and supportive atmosphere during the holidays. I hope that helps. Thanks for watching.